Good morning, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the session so far. My name is Denise Syndercombe Court, and I'm the Professor of Forensic Genetics here at King's College, London. I'd first like to say how moved I've been by the communications this morning, which have been very powerful. You may recognise this picture. For those that don't, this is Joseph James D'Angelo, and Lizzie has already talked about him this morning, also known as the Golden State Killer. And his identification has sparked an interest in the use of genetic genealogy to look at cold cases in the United States. In Visalia, California, in the early 1970s, there was a spate of burglaries that had an associated sexual nature. But these seemed to stop in about 1975, and in the second half of the 70s, there was a series of reports of rapists. And the possible perpetrator was referred to as the East Area Rapist. And then in the early 1980s, there was a series of murders by someone who was referred to as the original Night Stalker. As with all unresolved crimes, cold cases undergo review, and these crimes were linked because they were similar. And importantly, the DNA from the second and the third series showed that the offender was the same person. However, there were more than 8,000 suspects, which is an unwieldy number for any investigation. Around 15 years later, the case was revisited. There were no database matches, and familial searching anyway won't reveal anything other than very close relatives in police databases. They did some male Y chromosome testing, and they did find a match with the crime scene material, but again, that proved false. They then turned to direct-to-consumer tests, which were becoming very popular in the population in general, such as those that you will have seen offered by people like Ancestry, 23andMe, and Family Tree DNA. Those companies hold publicly available databases that use contributors' DNA to suggest family links. Most of the contributors are of European heritage because they're researching their family trees. If I have a test with one company and my cousin has a test with another company, we may never be linked. But GEDmatch is a site where you could also put on your DNA from these different companies in one place so that they can be compared. So they did this with the case of the Golden State Killer, and they revealed about 1,000 distant relatives. The closest were about 20 or third or fourth cousins, and 2 of them had close links to the areas where the crimes were committed. So the investigators collected some discarded material from these possible suspects, and in 2018, Joseph James D'Angelo, who was a former police officer, was charged with 8 counts of murder, but clearly he had committed many other crimes. So how is this genetic testing done? DNA is composed of 2 strands in a helix held together by a sequence of 4 chemicals that you can see here. T, A, G, C are just shorthand for the names. And if you put one strand against the same strand from another person, you can compare the sequence. And sometimes there's a chemical in the sequence that will be different. Here you can see that the top person has an A, and at the bottom the person has a G. We call that a single nucleotide polymorphism, or a SNP for short. When you compare 2 people, the longer a shared sequence is, the more likely people are to be related. So when DNA from the parents is passed to the children, half each, the chromosome strands cross over, so the sequence changes a bit. And there'll no longer be a match, and this shared sequence will end. And as you move down the generation, so there's more opportunity for that crossover, and so the shared segments get shorter. Now we measure the length of these segments in something called centimorgans. I mean, that's not a physical length, but it relates to the probability that there will be a crossover. Once segments are all less than about 7 centimorgans, it's extremely unlikely that pairs of individuals are closely related. Here, this graph shows you people who are related from cousins on the left down to 6 cousins, and it measures the percentage chance that they will have at least 5 down to 1 segment of sufficient length shared between 2 people. So you can see on the left that 100% of first cousins will have at least 5 shared segments, whereas when you get down to the 6 cousins on the far right, only about 5% of them will have any shared segments, and most of them only 1. So even third cousins, which is in the middle, will not share any DNA, and then about 20% of them, they will only share 1 segment. Looking further at families, I've compared here the amount of DNA that you may share with your parent, which is about 50%, exactly 50% actually, and with your siblings. And that'll depend on whether you're full siblings or half siblings. Now, your children and your siblings' children will be cousins, and they will share less DNA with each other. And as you move down the generations, yours and your siblings' direct descendants will share less and less. So that on average, when you get down to third cousins, they'll share, on average, less than 1% of their DNA. Now, if you're doing a genealogy search and what you're looking is at a possible third cousin match, you will then probably have about 175 on average candidates. And as you move to more distant relatives, you may be looking at up to 1,500 fourth cousins, 17,500 fifth cousins, and 175,000 sixth cousins. And of course, many of those won't be on any databases that you discover, and most of them are not going to share any DNA with you at all. So perhaps it's understandable that the search for the Golden State Killer took many thousands of hours. Verification of a match is also important when you're looking at family trees. Here at the top is rather a complicated coloured bar, and it maps the single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, along chromosome 3, comparing 2 people. Let's say I'm compared with person 1, or match 1. I have a pair of chromosome 3s, and when I compare my sequences on the pair with person 1, wherever there's a red colour, a red bar, the SNP is different on both of my chromosomes to those from person 1 at the same position. And if it's yellow, then one of my pair matches the sequence in person 1. If it's green, then my sequence matches both pairs. So here you can see long stretches of yellow and green, which are the shared segments, and we can measure them. So there's a short sequence on the left, shown in the table, at about 17 centimorgans, and there's a much longer sequence on the right, about 130 centimorgans. So it looks good that I'm related to person 1. And I can do the same with another person. So you can see that there's quite strong evidence there that I'm also linked to person 2. Now, I need to know, if I'm building up my family tree, whether these 2 people I match come from the same side of my family tree or a different side of my family tree, my maternal or my paternal ancestor. So one thing I can do is take myself out of this mixture and just compare match 1 and match 2 directly. And here you can see the result. There are no segments, there's no table to indicate that there are no segments recorded here that are greater than 7 centimorgans. So there's no indication that these two people are linked on this chromosome. And if that pattern's repeated across all the chromosomes, then I can be confident that even though they're both related to me, they're not related to each other. I want to move on now to talk about our project, Action on the International Sexual Exploitation of Children. Our aims are twofold: identify the extent of the problem, and you've heard a lot about that and the difficulties this morning, but also to undertake a pilot investigation using genetic genealogy. And note that this will only be successful if the father is of European ancestry, because that is where the public databases, they hold data of Europeans. But many of the perpetrators of this exploitation are going to be European. If we identify the father, then we also want to be able to provide some legal support, because these children will have certain nationality rights. We recognize, of course, that a study like this, and that's been alluded to, the ethical considerations and the ethical difficulties of conducting studies in this area. And we must make sure that any actual live study we do is ethically acceptable. We have to put it through the King's College Ethics Committee and as well in the country where we're working. In designing our study, we've tried to consider all the issues, and we've talked to our wider group about what those issues might be. How are the participants going to be identified in the first place? They must be volunteers, and we've said that they must be adults over the age of 18 who believe they have a father of European ancestry. We'll use community and victim support groups to identify possible participants, but most importantly, we are not seeking to revisit the circumstances of their procreation, which could have been entirely consensual at the time. Our aim is to focus on the child. Informed consent, of course, to participate is vital, with emphasis on the informed. We will have people who are females, independent of the project, from the local community, who are also fluent in the local languages to support our participants. The participants must be given the opportunity to discuss the study with their family and friends, and we must document that they have done that. They've had that opportunity. And they'll also be given a copy of the consent form, because that will have all the details on it for them to withdraw their consent at any time. And that'll include a mobile number that they can use 24 hours a day if they require. Are we raising their hopes unnecessarily? Well, we may not find any potential relatives, and this possibility must be repeatedly made clear to them. They also need to understand that their participation can impact on members of their family that are not involved in the testing. And before they give any consent, we want them to rehearse both the emotional and the practical consequences of any outcomes that we reveal, whether it's positive or negative. So they've had the opportunity to think about these questions. Are we going to harm them? Well, the sample taking is painless, and we're not seeking or collecting any health-related information. And this is very different from the genealogy companies that will have that information. What about personal information? Well, once the samples have been collected, only 2 people at King's will have access, and that information will be held securely. No personal information will be provided to any of the testers, and any anonymized comparisons that we make to public sites will be removed immediately. And the participants can always request that all of their information is deleted at any time in the process. The samples themselves will only be identified by a code, and they'll be couriered to the testing sites, and all unused waste material, including the original swabs and everything, will be returned to King's for secure storage. Importantly, it's essential to state that the DNA does not belong to King's, which isn't necessarily the case if you engage with a genealogy company. It's the property of the donor. And normally at the end of any research study, the samples will be destroyed. But in case there are ongoing legal considerations, the participants will also be asked to sign a second consent form to allow the retention of their samples beyond the study if it's for a specific purpose. What about protection of the data? Now, we'll process that according to the UK GDPR. We won't share any information. Only anonymized data will be exposed for public search for as short a time as possible, and any data held electronically outside King's will be removed and stored securely at King's. Of course, any identified relationships can have legal consequences, and we want to provide, and we will provide, legal advice for the participants, which may extend outside the project. Finally, we ask ourselves, how will the study help the community in the future? We will, of course, publish our findings to enable a debate about its future usefulness. We aim to be able to build an ongoing relationship with a partner in the country so that we can share education and common research goals. We hope that if our pilot is successful, its wide knowledge will act as a deterrent and also provide an incentive for employers in the future to require that their employees give a secured DNA sample that will not only act as a deterrent in the aid industry, but also protect both the employers and their employees from false claims. The stimulus for this study didn't just come from the Golden State Killer. It was Margaret Simons, who you're going to hear from in a minute, who wrote about the cases of sexual exploitation in the Philippines, and Andrew McLeod, who you've met earlier, who before our project worked to identify the fathers of 5 out of 6 of these using genetic genealogy. Our pilot project is planned to take place in Africa and will only involve the identification of the fathers of 6 adult children. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child identified in Article 7 the right for the child to know information about their parentage. We can't find the fathers of all children born in these circumstances, but we hope that the possibility that they can be found will begin to act as a deterrent, and that employers of the future will begin to think about making use of DNA as a tool to protect against exploitation. Finally, this is a small study, and it is vital that we identify ethical issues and problems in the processes. Through this pilot, if more work is going to be done in the future, we may not yet have got it right. So thank you for listening. Any ideas you've got, for how we're approaching this study, I'd be welcome to hear about them. And I hope you'll find the next talk from Margaret Simons and her engagement in the Philippines stimulating. I expect there'll be some opportunities for chat later. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, and thanks again for the opportunity to share my work with you. That was a very interesting presentation. I got involved in this project as a journalist rather than as an academic, although interestingly, for most of the time that I was doing this work, I did hold a position at the University of Melbourne, and the journalism I did went through the ethics procedures of that university, not so much the DNA ethics, which came along later, as I'll describe. So this whole project started in Angolay City. It's spelt like Los Angeles, but it's actually pronounced Angolay. And it started as a piece of journalism. This gentleman, Dave Tacon, who is a colleague and photojournalist who I've worked with in a number of different areas of the world over many years, had heard a story about the abandoned children of Australian sex tourists. He'd heard this just really on the journalistic gossip networks and suggested that we should do a trip together to the Philippines. We had a number of pieces of journalism in mind, but one of them was to try and track down a particular little girl that we'd heard of called Maxine, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her later, who had an Australian father but was living in absolutely dire circumstances. And I should acknowledge that nearly all of the photos that I'm using in this presentation are photos that Dave took on the spot. So Angolay City is about 2 hours drive northwest of Manila, and it's a pretty extraordinary place. There are really only two industries in town. First off, pardon me, there is the former Clark Air Base, once one of the largest USA bases outside the USA, but now a special economic zone which hosts call centres and other back office functions serving Western businesses. And getting a job in one of those call centres is about the best you can hope for if you're a resident of Angolay City, but it usually requires good English language skills and a high level of education. Generally speaking, you need to have a university degree to work in a call centre in the Philippines. It's a very highly valued job. And the families we're talking about, often the mothers are themselves the children of sex tourists. So it's no longer the case of young women coming in from the provinces to the bright lights. It's now 3 and 4 generations of children of sex workers. And the other industry in town, where virtually all of them work, is Fields Avenue and the surrounding area, which is the sex tourism district. Older women will sometimes work as maids in the hotels, and the men will often work in the construction industry and building the hotels in which the sex tourists live. You can see a scene from inside one of the bars there, obviously the women pole dancing, and then if you look at the background there, you'll see the men, who are the main income source for our families. This is Walking Street, or Fields Avenue, which is the centre of the sex tourism industry there. And of course, it looks pretty grungy there. This is how it looks at night, all lit up. And again, you can see the men, many Australians, many Americans, a lot of British people, and increasingly South Koreans as well are the main customers in Walking Street. Another view from inside the clubs, and again, you can see the men sitting there with several women at their side. So there's really no other option if you want to earn an income and keep your family than working in some aspect of the tourism, which is overwhelmingly a sex tourism industry. I wrote in the first article about this that the town was effectively a brothel and the support system for a brothel. When we first went to Angolay City, we had the name of a charity, a Catholic charity, which we were told was working with the women, and we were planning to use that to seek access to some of the families and talk to them and look in particular for this little girl, Maxine. But within a few hours of arriving, talking to the women, we discovered that this charity to the extent that it was succeeding in getting money for the families, was actually taking kickbacks and was deeply resented by the women. And so we ditched them and decided that we would seek our own contacts. And very fortunately, we encountered this extraordinary woman, Margaret Simons, pictured here with her family. She's the one standing with her hands on her daughter's shoulders. She lives in Hadrian's Extension, which is only 5 minutes from Fields Avenue, but could be a world away. It is one of the worst slums I have ever seen, and I've done quite a lot of journalism in the developing world. Margaret Simons had worked in a call centre. She's got good English language skills. She has her own hard luck story as to why she's now living in Hadrian's Extension. But she was a respected neighbour of the families and quickly began to assist us to make contact with the families. And she continues to work with us today. She's actually enrolled as a registrant in this conference. I'm not sure whether she's watching right now, but none of this work that we've done would have happened without her. She is an amazing woman. One of the first children we found was Kevin and his mother, Rochelle. Rochelle told us that she believed Kevin's father was an Australian and she had been underage at the time that Kevin was born. We found Kevin living in a garden shed, effectively, or somewhere the size that most Australian families would regard a garden shed to be, and literally on this rubbish dump, so just to one side. When there's no other income available, rubbish picking is one of the main ways the families earn money. Rochelle had never heard from Kevin's father. She told him that she was pregnant and he cut her off. All she had was an email address and she never heard from him again. Now, Kevin became very attached to David in particular and would carry his camera bags for him, ride around on the motor scooters with us, and generally became our shadow, really, for the period that we were working in the community. And in a strange preface to what ended up happening, once I heard that Rochelle had been underage at the time, I asked if we could take a sample of his hair and fingernails, thinking that the Australian Federal Police, who've done quite a lot of work in Southeast Asia on Australian pedophiles, might be interested in following up. Of course, at that stage, I had no idea what was to happen, but the idea that DNA may be an answer for kids like Kevin was still in my mind. You can see there how unwell and malnourished he was, no access to running water or decent food at the time. Australians were very prominent. We saw signs like this all over town. In Fields Avenue, there are particular places that are set up like 1950s Australian milk bars, Australian football is live streamed and so on. This was very confronting for us. So we wrote our first article and it was published in the Monthly magazine, which is quite a well-known magazine in Australia, in July 2015, and it won a few awards and got quite a lot of attention. I was thinking of this in the earlier session about why doesn't this area get traction, because this one did get a bit of traction and people began to contact us wanting to help the kids, and they were sending us money, which of course was awkward. I mean, we're journalists, we're not aid workers, and we weren't at that stage a charity. But we felt very committed to the kids that we'd met, and David and I made a commitment both to each other and to the kids that we would try and go back there every year. We're both freelance journalists, so we need a commission if we're to go anywhere. But of course, the Philippines has been very newsworthy with the election of President Rodrigo Duterte and his war on drugs. We went back there in 2016. The main journalism we did was on the war on drugs, and this is one of David's pictures of people who've been locked up in a fetid cell because of the war on drugs. But we also, with radio journalist Heather Jarvis, did a documentary for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation about the kids of Angalay City. And of course, more people listened to it and more people started sending us money. Now, to this point, what we had been doing is simply transferring it to Maravik, who had distributed it to the families. But we began to realise that we needed something a little bit more formal, and we established Angalay Relief Incorporated, which is a not-for-profit, entirely volunteers. And effectively, we set up a system of sponsorship where Australian and other donors would send money to the kids. And Maravik, we put on a small salary as our on-the-ground fixer and facilitator. We're now supporting 9 families with regular aid and another half dozen with occasional assistance. The situation with COVID has made all of that much more intense. I'll talk about that a little more later. In 2018, on a 2018 visit, we got a commission from The Guardian magazine in England and did a big article which got a massive amount of attention in the UK. And as a result, Andrew McLeod contacted us. Now, I have to say, Andrew had a high hurdle to get over. We were very sceptical about him. And we had good reasons for that. During the period we've been doing this work, quite a lot of journalism now for different outlets, we'd been contacted by quite a few lawyers, and we wanted lawyers because while most of the mothers couldn't prove who the fathers were, some did know who the fathers were. And we wanted a lawyer to help us because in theory they should have been able to get child support because the Philippines and Australia have a reciprocal arrangement and a treaty which should have made that possible. And I would say about 6 lawyers had offered to help us and then had for various reasons dropped out, often just starting to ghost us or letting kids down. And that had been bitter for us and devastating for some of the kids. I certainly endorse what was said earlier about not letting these kids down once you've started trying to help them. So when Andrew approached us with this weird idea of DNA testing, we were extremely sceptical, and I have to say, made him jump through a whole load of hoops before we would agree to work with him. But long story short, he jumped through those hoops, he proved his mettle, and we did begin to work with him. So with Marivik's help, we introduced the idea of the DNA tests to the families that we have been dealing with most closely. We explained what could be done with DNA tests. Now, they're quite familiar with DNA because quite often a father will insist on a DNA test when one of the women tells them that she's pregnant. And indeed, in the bars of Angolay City, the beer mats have adverts on them for DNA testing because it's so common for a man to be accused of having fathered a child. And so DNA testing is a concept which they're well familiar with. But we explained that the aim would be to see if we could identify the fathers. I participated online in Facebook and other video conferencing, and the families, all of whom live close to each other and know each other, met to discuss the project, as well as meeting with Marivik and talking to her. And in short, they all consented. We didn't get a single person turning us down on this. The DNA tests were done in their homes with Marivik present. And then, of course, there was a big wait and the detective work began. So I'm just going to talk through some of the stories that came out of this exercise. Kim is the mother and Seif, her son. He actually likes to be called Alex these days. Again, this was one of the first families that we had contacted. Kim had been a sex worker, as she had later married to her current husband and had other children. They were living in very deprived conditions. Seif had asthma, wasn't able usually to afford medication, and the home that they're in didn't have any electricity of any sort, very reduced circumstances. They participated in the project, and it was the happiest story that we have to tell out of this project. Thanks to the DNA test, Seif's father, Michael, was traced. He was absolutely delighted to discover he had a son that he'd never dreamed existed. And very quickly, we put Seif in regular contact with his father, and he has 2 sisters who speak Tagalog, and the family is now in close contact, and his father is now completely supporting him. So whereas Angolay Relief had been providing basic support such as medication and so on, now he is entirely supported by his father, and his prospects are very good. And this is the most recent photo I have of him in school, where he's doing quite well. So that is an unqualified good news story. Angolay Relief is still keeping a watching eye on the relationship. Obviously, things can go wrong in any family. So we are still there in the background, ready to step in if there are, if the support stops. But there's absolutely no sign of that. They're just delighted with each other, the entire family. And that alone, I think, has justified the project from my point of view. Seth is the most delightful little kid, and his prospects are now good thanks to this project. Another case, which actually wasn't a DNA case, but it was the case which helped us to trust Andrew, was the case of John John. So John John's father was Anthony Hamilton, an Australian man. He lives in Melbourne, same city where I live. And in this case, the parenthood wasn't really in dispute. The smaller photo there you'll see is from Anthony Hamilton's Facebook presence, where there are plenty of pictures of him with a younger John John, having fun with him and behaving like a dad. And he's also acknowledged on the certificate of baptism, which I've also pictured there. But when we met John John, Anthony Hamilton had established a new relationship with another Filipino woman and had stopped paying child support. I tried to contact him when we were writing the first article. It may surprise you to know that not all men are keen to talk to journalists in these sorts of circumstances, and he basically refused to discuss it with me and refused to start paying child support again. And that was where things stood until Andrew got involved. And I don't know what he did. I joke that he talked bloke to Anthony, but Anthony is now paying child support to John John, and his life is much better as a result. In one of these trips, we found Maxine, the original child we'd heard about. She's pictured here with her grandmother, who's one of the best things going on in her life, the grandma. She was living in dreadful circumstances. You can see there she looks quite malnourished. This was taken not long after we'd found her, and she'd been very unwell. Her mother claimed to know who her father was, and he was still living in Anglo City. He's an Australian man. And though they had approached him many times, saying, here's your daughter, he had spurned them, sometimes physically pushed them, and refused to acknowledge that he was the father. Thanks to the DNA testing, we established that he was indeed the father. We've been in touch with Maxine's extended family in Australia. Unfortunately, they're a bit reluctant to get involved, but they have said that they will talk to her father when he gets back to Australia. But at the moment, he's still in Anglo City, and due to COVID, it's not at all clear when he's going to be returning to Australia. So we're at a bit of a dead end there. In the meantime, though, Anglo Relief is providing support to Maxine through the generosity of an Australian sponsor. She is in school and looking much better, as you can see. So we are hopeful that that will result in a case for child support eventually, but it's obviously going to be a hard one. Bridget Sickert is another of our cases. We found her on our third trip, again living in a home without any clean water or sanitation, an incredibly bright kid. We spoke to her school teacher, who the school has become very supportive of our work here, who told us that she was one of the top students in her class, but she was falling behind because she had been ill so often. They had no clean running water or sanitation. They were drawing water from the same creek that was used as a toilet by many in the community. So Bridget was in a very bad way. This is the home she was living in with her grandmother, Joanna, and her cousin, Ariel. You can't see it here, but it's just a dirt floor, and there ain't much room in that room other than the bed, which they all share to sleep on. So both the kids were missing an awful lot of school because of illness. So in this case, we have narrowed her parentage. Oh, that's her, by the way, on a bridge over the creek that I just mentioned, which is rubbish dump, toilet and water source. We've narrowed her parentage to one of two Canadian brothers. Only one of these two brothers was in the Philippines at the necessary time. And I have to say, this is an extraordinary story if anybody ever makes a movie out of this story, because it turned out that the man who is most likely, almost certain to be her father, was actually adopted. And there's just an extraordinary story, which I don't have time to tell here, as to how we discovered that he even existed. Sadly, he's disputing parentage, demanding another DNA test, not trusting ours. And there is a case currently before the Canadian courts. Again, Andrew has assisted us in finding pro bono lawyers to represent Bridget. In the meantime, the article that we wrote about Bridget did result in sponsorship, and she is now living in a much better apartment. She and her grandmother and cousin, they have access to clean water and sufficient food, and she's back in school and doing well. So we hope that eventually that will result in child support being paid, but sadly her father doesn't seem to want to have anything to do with her voluntarily. Melanie and Madeline are twins. They are adults now, but they were born to Ray Yates, who was a British civil engineer working in the Philippines, and Espy, or Esperanza de los Santos. They met in an Anglo City bar, and they had a 3-year relationship. So again, parentage was not disputed. There are pictures of Yates with the twins as very young babies. And when the relationship broke up, he did provide some money, enough to buy a humble house. So the girls weren't so much concerned about money, but they had for years been trying to contact Ray Yates, and he had spurned all their attempts. The main thing they had for him was a LinkedIn profile. They'd messaged him on that and had no response. And one of the things I was able to do for them is use some journalistic skills to track him down. He was living in Milton Keynes. And again, thanks to Andrew, he has now supported the girls in getting a legal acknowledgement that he is indeed their father. And that means, of course, that they could take up British citizenship and get British passports. So far, they haven't shown any interest in doing this. Madeline is now at university studying architecture. She's supported by another ARI sponsor. And for the moment, they are content with simply knowing their father. He has been less than consistent in keeping in touch with them, but they do at least have a phone number and an email address for him and have had some conversations with him. So better than nothing, could be better. Not all the stories work out well, unfortunately. It was mentioned earlier on that 5 out of 6 have had parents identified. This is one where we haven't been able to succeed. Nellie, the mother, identified Michelle's father as a Scotsman called Guthrie. I spent a lot of time trying to track him down in Scotland. But the DNA testing seems to suggest that that's probably not right. But we have hit a dead end on trying to trace her parentage, which has been a huge disappointment to them, of course, but it does at the same time seem that Nellie might well have been wrong in her identification of the parent. Here's Justin and his mother Shelley. We have tracked Justin's family. They are Australians, and we've narrowed his parentage down to one of 2 brothers. However, the family is clearly estranged. There seems to be an awful lot of hostility within the family, and the family members that we have tracked down and contacted will have nothing to do with us and don't seem to want to have anything to do with Justin's dad either. Now, he's now over 18. He wasn't when we first met him, so child support is not an issue, but he would dearly love to know his Australian family. And rather sadly, he said to Andrew in one of their conversations when we were trying to explain to him, I get it. They don't like my dad, so they don't like me. We are still hoping that perhaps some member of the family will eventually want to know the other bit of the family. As you can see there, Justin is a very tall young man. He doesn't resemble any of his Filipino relatives. I think he almost certainly does closely resemble his Australian family. Hopefully one day he will get to know them. So I was last in Anglo City in 2019. I have been back every year since 2015 until, of course, 2020 when I couldn't travel due to COVID. And David and I treated all the kids we know, not all of whom have been involved in the DNA project, that's a subset, to a meal at Jollibee, which is the local answer to McDonald's. So there you see several of them looking a lot happier than they have done. The kid on the far right there in the black t-shirt, that's Kevin, who I showed to you when he was living on the dump. You can see how well he's grown and how much better he's looking. Kevin has also done a DNA test, but we're at the very early stages of that being processed, so we don't have any news for him yet. But as I said earlier, his mother believes that his father is an Australian, and he would have committed an offence given that Kevin's mother was underage at the time. So that is one to watch. COVID has prevented us visiting in 2020 and this year. You may not be aware, but Australia at the moment has a travel ban in place. You can't leave the country without special consent from the government. But I fully intend to go back as soon as I can, and I'm glad in a small way to have made a difference to some kids' lives. I realise it's a very small exercise. I'm not an aid worker. I've had to deal with a lot of ethical and difficult issues, which I certainly wasn't trained for. But nevertheless, I think we can say that we've made a significant difference in these kids' lives. And the DNA testing project has been absolutely transformative for those kids where it's succeeded. And that's the end. I'll stop sharing now and happy to take any questions. If I can find out how to stop sharing. There we go. Stop sharing. So I can't see any questions here. So maybe we just stop here. What's the feeling? Okay, well, no questions, so I'll end the session there. Thanks very much.